Hi everyone, Carl Steele here for English 3111, Fall 2022, Brooklyn College, talking about the Middle English poem Sir Orfeo, a 14th century Middle English version of the Orpheus story. I have pictured here one of the manuscripts of the poem. This is from Ashmole 61, and I encourage you, if you like, to look up how this poem begins in the version of this poem that's edited on the team's Middle English website. You will find that it's different from the one that you read for this class, and that's something I'll be talking about later in this presentation. The Middle English Sir Orfeo is a version of the old story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which dates back to the ancient Greeks. In that version, Orpheus and Eurydice are barely married before she's bitten by a snake and she dies. And he follows her into Hades, which is where the dead dwell. And being a very accomplished musician, he plays music and so charms the people in the land of the dead that he's allowed to bring Eurydice back with him on one condition, that he not look over his shoulder back at her as she follows him out of hell. Well, of course he does that, and she's drawn back into hell, and Orpheus emerges onto the surface, bereft, and eventually he's torn to pieces by the Bacchantes, these mad women, but that's a different story. The Middle English version of this anglicizes this in various ways and medievalizes it. So in this version, Eurydice, who's called Herodes, wakes up under a tree after taking a nap, and she's tearing at her face in terror. And her husband, Orfeo, says, what's going on? She says, well, the fairy king has come to me and says he's going to take me, and if I refuse him, I'll be torn limb from limb. And Orfeo says, well, let's set up a shield wall around you. My entire army will protect you. But she's just plucked out from the middle of them. There's no way to prevent it. So Orpheus gives his kingdom to his steward and says, I'm just going to leave and go into the wilderness. He dresses himself up like a penitent, and he goes into the wilderness and mourns. And then one day he encounters this aristocratic troop hunting, and among them is his wife. They recognize each other, and he follows her into the land of Faerie through a rock. We have to imagine this is some kind of cave. And he sees this beautiful, bright and shining land, but when he enters into it, it also is quite creepy because there are people who have been plucked into Faerie at the very moment when they're on the verge of death, people who are dying in childbirth, people who are trying to kill themselves, people in all kinds of terrible positions of suffering who are there in kind of a static perpetuity of not quite alive, not quite dead, and among them is Eurydice. Orpheus plays his music, and he is granted one wish by the fairy king. He says, I'd like to take that beautiful woman back with me. The fairy king doesn't want to let him do that, but Orpheus says, well, do you want to be a liar? And so she follows him out of hell. In fact, he gets her back, sort of, in this version. He returns back to Thrace, and he encounters his steward, but is basically so wrecked because he spent so much time in the wilderness, the steward doesn't recognize him. This is to Orpheus's advantage. He says, Orpheus died. I know that he's dead. And the steward weeps, and he tears at his hair, and he says, there is no remedy of man's death. It is no bote of man's death, he says. And Orpheus says, well, because you wept for me, I'm going to give you my kingdom, and this is all yours. And that is more or less where the story ends. It's a story, I think, that's about death and irrecoverability. And I could talk more about that issue of death in class, but let me just share with you some bits of the Middle English. This is an example of an ubi sunt. That's from a Latin phrase, ubi sunt que ante nos, where are they who came before us? Or the French will often say, où sont les neiges d'antan? Where are the snows of yesteryear? And it's a way to list all the things that you have lost. Basically, to talk about how your life is now a catastrophe by remembering all the things that you used to have that were wonderful. We have here part of the Auchinleck manuscript, which is the oldest version, written version of this that we have. Here is that passage from it. And I'm going to read this to you in Middle English. I'll talk about the poetic features a little bit, talk about the language, and translate it, of course, for you. He that had castles and tours, river, forest, fritzle floors, now they it commence to snow and freeze, this king mot mak his bed in mise. He that had kneets of prease before him kneeling and lived ease. Now saith he nothing that him leaketh, but wild worms be him streaketh. He that had plenty of meat and drink, of aged and tay. Now may he all day dig and rot, ere he find his field of rot. In summer he liveth bewealed fruit, and burying but good lead. In winter may he nothing find but rota glasses and rinda. So this is done with rhyming couplets. It's probably because it's based on a French model for writing this kind of Breton lay, which were also done in rhyming couplets. That's how Marie de France wrote. So it tells us something about what this person is reading. They're reading French poetry, probably. And we also get a sense that the manuscript is already a little bit corrupt because we have one place where there's a rhyming word without a word next to it. The couplet fails. Lita doesn't have a word. So we already get a sense that the Auchinleck manuscript, although it's the oldest, is already a bad copy. It's the best, probably the best we have, though. So some features that I've highlighted here. That had castles and tours. We would translate that in modern English as he who had. Again, Middle English does not have the relative pronoun who. It has the interrogative pronoun who is that, but it wouldn't have he who had. It would have he that had. So in modern English, we would do that as who. The ETH ending indicates that we are not, this is not an older version of Middle English, it's a different dialect. This is a Southern dialect. The eth ending for the third person. Now saith he liveth, right? That's a verb ending. We don't do that in modern English anymore because we're using a different dialectical form of the verb, right? But this is how they did it in the South, ETH. But means but, of course, but in Middle English it's often used as except or unless is often you see that. Each, although that looks like the first person pronoun, I, here it's being used as each dainty, each delicacy. Ere is a word you often see in Middle English. Again, it means before, ere, E-R-E in modern English, not very often used. And the ending, en, berien, en is one way to mark a plural. So obviously the s is a standard way of doing that in this particular dialect, castles and tours, but they can also do it with an en. We don't have that very much in modern English, but words like oxen and brethren are, of course, plural forms of brother and ox. So to translate this, he who had castles and towers, rivers, forests, woodlands with flowers. Now, although it begins to snow and freeze, the king has to make his bed in moss. He who had excellent knights kneeling before him, and ladies, now he sees nothing that pleases him, except for wild worms that glide by him. He who had plenty of food and drink of each delicacy, now he has to all day dig and grub before he finds his fill of roots. In summer he lives by wild fruit and berries of little worth. In winter he can find nothing except roots, grasses, and bark. So this might remind you of Chaucer's former age. And so when I asked, what is the mood of Chaucer towards these people? Well, it's simultaneously admiration, but it's also a kind of contempt for their miserable life. And it's possible that Chaucer might have had passages like this in mind because it's possible that he might have read the Auchinleck manuscript. But this also should remind you that Orpheus is in a kind of living dead state. Because you say that he sees nothing around him that he likes, that he used to have wonderful things, and now he doesn't have anything at all, and that he's just kind of digging in the ground. He's like part of the ground, and he's surrounded by worms, snakes crawling by him. What does this remind you of except for somebody who's actually in the grave? And the way that his skin shrinks and dries out suggests he's a kind of living corpse. So there's already a sense in which Orpheus is gone into the wilderness and is chosen in a way to live in a living dead state to kind of match the state that Eurydice herself is in. And so in class, we can talk more about that issue of death and living death. But in the second part of this video, I want to introduce you to how academic articles work and do that through the example of an excellent recent article on Sir Orfeo. So I have this screenshot here of the title page. And what we have here is, of course, the title of the journal itself where this article is published. So journals publish articles. That's the element that they have inside them. This is called the Review of English Studies. This came out in 2022. This is volume 73. So this is probably the 73rd year that this particular journal has been published. And what we have here with the title of journals is they often have the words review or journal in it. In medieval studies, the title of the journal is often something in Latin, speculum traditio, viator medium avum, for example. Or if you have them in French, they might be the cahier, that's the journal basically. But it's basically a kind of general title that indicates the container that's going to have journal articles in it. We also have the name of the article, verse craft, editing, and the work, Shadows of Orfeo, and the name of the author, who is Daniel Sawyers. Below that, we have the abstract. What is an abstract? Is a summary of the entire contents of the article. So here it is. Basically, if you're in a hurry, as most scholars are, you can read the abstract and get an immediate sense about whether this is something that you want to keep reading. So it'll tell you almost everything you need to know, and then you can dig into the article itself and look at the particular evidence. So you can already get a sense this is very, very different from the kinds of articles you might find online, because it's really not trying to get you to linger with it as long as possible. It wants to be as useful as possible and to help you get in and out quickly if you need to. If we go to the very end of this article, as I have done here, we see it ends here, and then we have what it says after here, Merton College, University of Oxford, UK, and Daniel Sawyers' name is up there. I'll explain what all that means. Well, I'll say that we're missing something at the end that we might often expect to encounter, which is the bibliography. That is, all the scholarship that has been cited in this article is often put at the end of the article. But in some journals, they do all of that in the footnotes. And so that is what this particular journal does. It puts everything in the footnotes, so there's no bibliography at the end. That's somewhat inconvenient, but they do it with the interest of saving space. We also have the affiliation of the writer. So it tells us where Daniel Sawyers works as an academic. Many academics don't have academic jobs, and so it will say non-affiliated. That means that they are working in other industries, in insurance, or they're baristas or whatever, because it's very hard to get a permanent job in this profession. In this case, Daniel Sawyers has been fortunate enough to land a very good job indeed at Merton College at Oxford University in the United Kingdom. And you can even look that up further and get a sense of what his education is, what his background is, right? So this is designed as a kind of not just a signature that tells us where he works, but also gives us a kind of authority. It tells us what institution he's affiliated with. So when I publish something, it has my name. It also says Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York. And so it shows that I'm part of this particular institution. It's their funding and their support of me that has allowed me to do my scholarship. So we see that Daniel Sawyers did his BA in 2010, which to me feels very recent, and finished his PhD in 2016, came out with a book in 2022 called Reading English Verse in Manuscript circa 1350. So that's from around the year 1350 to circa 1500, published by Oxford UP, that is Oxford University Press, quite recently, just a couple of years ago. This article is about how similes function in this poem. So it's looking at a very common poetic device, a simile or a comparison, and just trying to figure out how it is they work. So looking at something that's seemingly inconsequential and trying to figure out basically the interesting thing it's doing. And so as Sawyers manages to observe quite convincingly, is a comparison in this poem tends to obfuscate rather than illuminate. So it obscures rather than enlightens things. It actually makes comparison is a marker of uncertainty. It erupts at moments when characters fail to understand each other, in connection with the baffling appearance of fairyland, and when Orfeo is disguised on his way home. And that's a very interesting observation. I think it really helps us understand some of the ways that this poem is working. So here are some examples. Orfeo says to Herodes when she wakes up from her terrible dream, he says, "Alas, the road that was so red is all wan as thou were dead." Alas, your face, which was so red, it was so ruddy, is now all pale as if you were dead. So as if you were dead, that's the simile. And then when Orfeo enters the fairy world, he come into a fair contrée, es bricht so son on summer's day. He came into a beautiful country as bright as the sun on a summer's day. Es bricht so son on summer's day. That's the simile, right? It's being compared to a summer's day. And then when Orfeo returns to Thrace and he's seen by the people who live there, they say about him, "He is klungen also a tree." He is gnarled like a tree. He's being compared to a tree. So what is he at this moment? Is he just a minstrel or is he a king? Well, as Sawyers says, I'll read the quotation I have here. Before Orfeo abandons his kingdom, narration was the sole perspective. Proximity to and then entry into fairyland have reduced narration to one perspective among many. Outside of fairyland, imaginative comparisons are associated with the direct speech of baffled characters. In fairyland, the narration itself takes up comparison, implying that here the voice delivering the poem, probably often a real voice, reading aloud to listeners, takes on some of the same bafflement. So what we have in the opening part of the poem is that when a character makes a comparison, it's a character speaking it to other characters. And that uncertainty is something that's kind of locked within the quotations, or something, the speech that the characters saying to each other. But as Orpheus enters into the fairyland, those comparisons become kind of general. They enter into the narration itself. And that element of bafflement and uncertainty that a simile marks, where a simile is saying you're like this thing, but you're not fully that thing, that bafflement and uncertainty becomes something that's kind of general to the entire feeling of the poem. So that by the time we exit the poem, we are now in a world where we don't really know what is really happening. And we can track that by paying attention to this particular poetic device. I think it's a very clever argument. But to make this argument, Daniel Sawyers has to do some difficult things. He has to establish just simply what Sir Orfeo is. You may say, well, it's quite easy. I just read it. Well, sort of. There are 3 manuscript versions of this in Middle English. They are all the same poem, but there's many, many differences. Famously, the opening of the version you read is lacking in the most authoritative manuscript, the Auchinleck, which is the oldest. But none of the 3 manuscripts are directly related to one another. That is, one is not copied from another one. They are all kind of copied from different versions, so there's a very kind of broad family of this, and it's hard to trace which one is talking to which one. And what Sawyer does in his argument is he looks at all 3 manuscripts and he finds moments that have shared language that's certainly the same language roughly in at least 2 of the manuscripts, generally relying on Auchinleck plus another one of the manuscripts, like the Ashmole 61. And he's able to say, okay, we can say that this bit here is similar enough that we can talk about what this poem is doing with simile here. And he's able to establish this pattern quite nicely by, again, as it were, kind of reading the 3 surviving manuscripts side by side. To do this, though, he's got this article that the first 11 pages of it asks, can we even close read this poem? What is Sir Orfeo? Because close reading is what he's doing. He's paying very close attention to how similes work in this poem, but what is the poem that he's even looking at? So he really has to establish over 11 pages that he's even allowed to do the thing that he's going to be doing. And so the argument itself is really only the last 7 pages of this article. Really, he has to do so much legwork in order to get us to that point. And again, I think it's a very interesting article. I think it tells us something illuminating, not only about how simile works in the poem, but also how simile relates thematically to the themes of death and uncanniness and uncertainty in this poem. But let me talk now finally about what distinguishes academic from amateur writing. So what I'm about to say here, there are some very loose divisions, but I think it might be helpful for you to understand the kind of work that someone like Daniel Sawyers does and the kind of work that I do when I'm not teaching or doing administrative work, when I'm writing scholarship. So the academic writer, unlike the amateur writer, is a trained expert. They have years of training and supervision by other people who are trained experts. And by trained experts, I mean people with credentials from reputable institutions. So you can see already that we can challenge some of these points, but I think this is generally a useful way to understand it. Before an article like this is published, it has been assessed by other experts as publishable. That is, it has been peer reviewed. So I am very often sent book manuscripts or articles to judge in my particular field, which is medieval animal studies. And if it's worthwhile, I will say that. And if it's not worthwhile, I will say that. But generally, I'll write 2 to 3 to 4 pages of comments explaining why this article should be published, or why it should not be published because it's terrible, or why it should be heavily revised before it's published. It's quite a lengthy process. It can take years for an article to finally see print once it made its way past all the experts in the way, as it were, there to prevent bad scholarship from being published and also to help enable good scholarship to be as good as it possibly can be. The audience for these articles is other experts, other people who have lots and lots and lots of training. So they don't have to explain why this stuff is important necessarily, because there's a base level of interest in this material. When Daniel Sawyers is writing about Sir Orfeo, he's going to be writing for an audience of people who already know the poem and already understand that it's one of the most interesting Middle English poems. And he's going to be saying something new about the ways that we can read this poem at all and write about it at all. So he's trying to say something new. He's trying to find something to add to the existing scholarly conversation. So I have an example here of some of his footnotes, and you can see how dense this is with citation. He's read a lot of stuff, and he's not citing everything he's read. There are hundreds of articles in this poem probably, and I'm sure he's read most of them, but he's going to cite the ones that are only useful to him, right? Not everything. So what you have to do, though, is you have to demonstrate that you have knowledge of the existing scholarly conversation that's relevant to the particular argument you're making. So in all this, it's not like a newspaper or magazine article. It's not like a self-published media, blogging, Instagram essays, TikToks, etc. It's done over a process of months and years, and it has been supervised for years and years and years of training prior to that, and by experts by years and years before it's really published. And so I imagine that this tends to produce work that's of a higher quality and more reliable than you're going to find in other places. And it's going to be distinguished from the work, I think, of people who are not experts yet, but you can get there with lots and lots of work and attention and care. Does this mean that what's published in an academic journal is always good? Absolutely not. Standards change, standards of what we care about change, and certainly in the course of preparing this video, I read a lot of stuff that I thought was pretty mediocre. So you do what you can, but humans are fallible creatures, and I think, though, academic scholarship is valuable as a base level of providing an expert service. So I'm looking forward to our conversation in class this week.